The old music academy stood like a quiet giant at the end of a cobblestone street, its stone walls holding a century of secrets. Inside, the air always felt different. It was thick with the scent of old wood, rosin from stringed instruments, and the faint, ghostly perfume of sheet music that had been handled by thousands of hands before. This was a place for the brilliant, the driven, the born to play. And then there was Lair to most people at the academy. Alara was like a piece of furniture you walk past every day, but never truly see. She was there in the same library, Carol, in the same back row of the lecture hall, but she never really registered. She was in her early 20s, with a soft way of speaking, and eyes that seemed to be looking at something 1,000 miles away. She was a music theory major, a path considered safe and academic, a place for those who loved music but lacked the fire to perform it. Her clothes were simple, her hair was usually pulled back in a loose bun, and she carried her books clutched to her chest like a shield. She moved through the grand hallways, with their portraits of famous composers, as if she were afraid of disturbing the dust. She had friends. But they were the kind of friends you have lunch with once a week, not the kind you shared your soul with. They knew her as kind, a little quiet, and remarkably good at explaining the complex rules of counterpoint. They saw her struggle in the mandatory minor performance classes. They heard her play simple scales and pieces, and while she wasn't terrible, she wasn't good either. Her playing was careful, technical, and completely devoid of life. It was like reading a beautiful poem in a flat, monotone voice. In a place that pulsed with passion and raw talent, her careful correctness was a kind of failure. The kings of this world were two men who ruled the performance department with an iron will wrapped in velvet tradition. The first was Professor Thorne, a man whose name was spoken in hushed, reverent tones. He was a world-renowned pianist, with silver hair slicked back from a high forehead and eyes that missed nothing. He believed talent was a raw, wild thing that had to be beaten into submission by discipline. He was a gatekeeper, and he knew it. His gaze could make a student's hands shake, and his critiques were legendary for their surgical precision. He wasn't cruel for the sake of it, but he was utterly merciless in his pursuit of what he called artistic truth. Always at his side was Professor Cardew, his younger, less polished shadow. Cardew was a good pianist, but he wasn't a great one, and everyone knew it, especially him. He was Thorne's most devoted follower, his ideas, his posture, his very way of speaking, a pale imitation of the master. Cardew handled the more day-to-day grunt work of the department, and he did so with an air of borrowed importance. He was the one who would give the smaller, less important corrections, always careful to phrase them in a way that aligned with Thorne's grand philosophies. He was the enforcer, the one who made sure Thorne's high standards were felt in every practice room every year. As winter began to tighten its grip on the city, the department held an event they called the Winter Gauntlet. It wasn't a recital. It was a trial. The idea was to force every performance student to tackle a piece of music that was just beyond their reach, to push them into a place of struggle and, hopefully, transformation. It was Professor Thorne's favorite tradition. The day the challenge was announced, the entire department was packed into the large, cold auditorium. The stage was empty except for a single, gleaming grand piano under a stark spotlight. Professor Thorne walked onto the stage, his steps echoing in the silent room. He wasn't holding any sheet music. He didn't need it. He stood behind the lectern and scanned the sea of young, anxious faces. "Welcome," he began, his voice a low, powerful rumble that filled the space. "Welcome to the gauntlet. Many of you think you have talent. You believe that passion is enough. Let me assure you, it is not. Passion without discipline is just noise. Talent without work is a tragedy waiting to happen." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "This year, we will explore a piece that separates the players from the pretenders. We will study the Scherzo of the Restless Soul by Victor Krzyzewski." A ripple of murmurs went through the room. Every serious musician knew the name Krzyzewski. He was a madman composer from the last century, a man who wrote music so technically complex and emotionally violent that most pianists refused to even look at his scores. The Scherzo was his most infamous creation. It was said to require impossible handspans, finger-twisting speed, and a depth of emotional understanding that belonged more to a poet than a pianist. It was a piece built to break people. Krashevsky Thorn continued, his voice taking on a near-religious tone, demands everything from you. Your fingers will bleed. Your mind will ache. And if you are truly lucky, you will touch something real in the chaos. This is not a test of your fingers. It is a test of your soul. His eyes swept the crowd again, but this time they were slower, more deliberate. He was looking for something, or someone. The students shifted in their seats, hoping not to be chosen for whatever demonstration he had planned. His gaze passed over the bright, confident faces of the department's stars. He skipped over the nervous, fidgeting ones. Then his eyes stopped. He found his target in the back row, a small figure trying to make herself even smaller. You, Thorn said, his voice suddenly sharp, cutting through the silence. A single spotlight clicked on, blinding Ilara where she sat. Yes, you. The young woman in the back? Stand up. A gasp went through the students. Everyone knew who she was. The quiet one. The theory major. The one who couldn't play with feeling. Ilara flinched as the light hit her. Slowly, she pushed herself to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The entire auditorium was staring at her. She could feel the weight of their pity and confusion. What is your name? Thorn asked, though it was clear he already knew it. Ilara, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ilara, Thorn repeated, letting the name settle over the room. He turned to the rest of the students. Many of you will approach this piece with arrogance. You will think your natural talent is enough. Ilara here will approach it with humility. It is a quality we do not see enough of. He turned back to her, and for a second his expression was almost gentle. But it was the gentleness of a predator before it strikes. Miss Ilara, you will be our guide this semester. You will perform the scherzo at the Winter Gauntlet. The silence that followed was deafening. It was an impossible demand. It was a public sentence to failure. Whispers erupted, a wave of shock and sympathy washing over the room. Professor Cardew, who was standing in the wings, allowed himself a small, tight smile. This was a brilliant move by Thorn. By setting up the most incapable student for the most spectacular fall, he would make a point that no one would ever forget. Ilara felt a hot flush of shame crawl up her neck. She could feel tears pricking the back of her eyes, but she fought them down. She wouldn't give them that. She wouldn't let them see her cry. She just stood there, bathed in the unforgiving light, or a living lesson in humiliation. Thorn let the whispers die down before he spoke again. Do not think of this as a punishment, Miss Ilara. Think of it as a gift. An opportunity to understand that art is not about comfort. It is about sacrifice. It is about pressure. And who knows? He gave a final dismissive shrug. Perhaps you will surprise us all. Though I doubt it. He gave a curt nod. You may sit. The spotlight clicked off, plunging her back into the relative dimness of the auditorium. Ilara sank into her chair, her legs trembling. All around her, she could feel the stares of her classmates. Some looked horrified for her. Others were trying to hide their smirks. She had been put on display, not as a musician, but as a joke. And as she sat there, listening to Professor Thorn drone on about rigor and truth, a cold, hard feeling began to form in her chest, a tiny, unyielding spark beneath the layers of fear and shame. They had no idea what they had just done. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They thought they were setting a lamb up for the slaughter. They had no idea they had just woken a loons. Asterisk, the announcement hung in the air long after the auditorium emptied, a dark cloud that seemed to follow Ilara everywhere. The next day, the Academy's gossip machine was working overtime. The story was already becoming a legend, Thorn and the Theory Girl. It was the perfect tragicomedy for a world that fed on drama. Ilara was no longer just a ghost in the halls. She was a ghost with a spotlight on her, a character in a story she never asked to be in. Asterisk, the pressure was a physical thing, a weight on her shoulders that made her slouch even more than usual. Every glance from a classmate felt like a judgment. Every whisper in the hallway sounded like her name. The professors, Thorn and Cardew, were the worst. They didn't ignore her now. They watched her a new, cruel sport for them, in her mandatory practice sessions. Professor Cardew took it upon himself to guide her. He would stand behind her, a shadow looming over the piano, his voice a constant, low drone of condescension. "Now, Alara, let's not be too ambitious," he'd say, tapping a measure on the sheet music with his finger. The paper was already beginning to look worn, a map of her supposed struggle. Just the first 4 bars. Yes, just that. Try to get the rhythm correct. 1, 2, 3, 4. You see? It's not so bad when you break it down. He would make her play the same simple melody line over and over, sighs of feigned patience, growing louder with each repetition. The note is C-sharp, dear. Not C, listen to the sound. It's a sound of pain, of longing. It's not. A sound of, well, of whatever it is you're making. He was treating her like a child, a simpleton who couldn't grasp the most basic concepts. And Alara let him. She would nod, her brow furrowed in a perfect imitation of concentration. Her fingers would plunk out the notes, intentionally clumsy, always slightly off the beat, or a fraction of a second too slow. She'd miss the sharps and flatter the flats, her face a mask of frustrating effort. It was a performance, and it was her best one yet. In these moments, she wasn't the quiet theory student. She was an actor playing the role of the failure everyone expected. Professor. Thorne's approach was more of a psychological warfare. He wouldn't speak to her directly during the day. He would just watch. He would stand across the hall, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, his gaze sharp and analytical. He looked like a scientist observing a lab specimen. He was waiting for her to break. He wanted to see the moment the hopelessness finally crushed her spirit. It was to him the most important lesson the Academy could teach. He believed that true artists were forged in the fire of their own inadequacy. He was just the one holding the bellows. Alara played her part for her audience of peers, too. She would spend her scheduled hours in the general practice rooms, the ones with thin walls where you could hear everything. She would play the same few measures of the scherzo over and over, each time a little worse than the last. It was always a mess of wrong notes, rushed tempos, and frustrated sighs. Sometimes she would even groan out loud, a sound of utter defeat. Her friends, the few who dared to talk to her, would offer sympathetic pats on the back. "He's being so unfair," one of them would say. "Why did he pick you?" "It's just cruel." "I don't know," Alara would mumble, looking down at her scuffed shoes. "I'm just ... trying. It's so hard." And it was believable. She looked exhausted all the time. She had dark circles under her eyes that weren't just from late-night studying. She seemed to carry a heavy, invisible burden. She became the Academy's official charity case. Students would leave little encouraging notes on her music stand. "You can do it. And don't let him get you down." They felt sorry for her. They admired her for not quitting, even though they all knew she was doomed. The worst part was that she started to feel the part. The constant negativity, the weight of everyone's low expectations. It was heavy. Sometimes, in the quiet of her dorm room, she would look at her hands, her strong, capable hands, and feel a flicker of doubt. Was she being arrogant? Did she really think she could do this? But then she would close her eyes and remember. She would remember the feeling of music, not as a collection of notes on a page, but as a living thing. And that's when the other part of her life would begin. Every evening. After the last library light flickered out and the last student retreated to their room, Alara would not go back to her dorm. She would pull on a worn coat, wrap a scarf around her neck, and walk the 20 minutes to the city bus stop. The bus ride was her decompression chamber. The rumble of the engine, the quiet murmur of strangers heading home or to late shifts. It was all a world away from the suffocating expectations of the Academy. She would get off in a quiet, working-class neighborhood, a place of tidy little houses and small corner shops. This was her other world. She would walk up the steps to a small, second-floor apartment, take out a single key, and unlock the door. This was her grandmother's home. Her grandmother, a woman who had loved poetry and roses and who had, in the corner of her small living room, kept an old, slightly out-of-tune upright piano. It was her most prized possession. It was on this piano that Alara, a shy 7-year-old with hands too small to reach an octave, had first discovered the magic. She wasn't taught in any formal way. She just knew. Her fingers would find the chords, her ear would tell her the harmonies. It was a language she was born speaking. But her father, a practical man who saw the world in numbers and facts, saw it differently. A pretty hobby, he had called it, but not a future. We need to focus on things that will get you somewhere. Science? Maybe. Not this. This dream stuff. Her passion was driven underground. It became a secret, something she did only for herself. A private conversation between her and the music. Now, in the quiet of her late grandmother's apartment, Ilara would take off her coat and scarf, a layer of the academy falling away with each garment. She wouldn't even turn on the main light, letting the warm glow from a small lamp on the side table illuminate the space. She would sit down on the familiar wooden bench, the one with the slight dip in the middle from thousands of hours of practice. Her sheet music, the same worn-out copy she used at the academy, sat on the music rack. But she didn't need it. She would close her eyes, and her fingers would hover over the yellowed ivory keys. And then she would begin. In this room, there was no clumsy Ilara. There was no struggling theory student. There was only the music. The first notes that came from the old upright piano were not hesitant. They were not wrong. They were pure, clean, and filled with a power that the old wood of the instrument seemed to relish. The scherzo of the restless soul, which sounded like a painful stuff, chaotic mess in the academy practice rooms, here was transformed. It was a storm, yes, but a controlled, beautiful storm. Her fingers, which fumbled and stumbled during the day, flew across the keys with impossible speed and grace. They did things that shouldn't have been possible, navigating the dense, tangled chords with an ease that was almost supernatural. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was telling the story. She understood the restless soul of the piece, its anger, its moments of heartbreaking sadness, its flashes of joy. She would play for hours, lost in the world of the music. Here, she wasn't performing for anyone. She wasn't trying to prove anything to Professor Thorne or Professor Cardew. She was just a musician and her piano. It was in these late-night sessions, alone in the soft lamplight, that the true Ilara existed. This was the prodigy. This was the artist. This was the person Thorne had so cruelly dismissed. She was a secret, and her secret was this beautiful, terrifying, perfect piece of music. As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky outside her window, she would finally stop. The last note would hang in the air for a moment, a ghost of a sound. She would sit there, breathing deeply, feeling the quiet hum of the music still vibrating inside her. Then she would carefully close the keyboard lid, smooth out the sheet music, and get ready to go back. Back to being the quiet, struggling girl everyone felt sorry for. She would put on her coat, walk to the bus stop, and return to the academy, ready to play her part again. She was living two lives, and only she knew that the quiet mouse everyone pitied was, in the darkness, a roaring lioness, waiting for the right moment to show the world her roar asterisk. The days that followed the announcement felt like walking through thick, heavy mud. Every step Ilara took through the academy's long hallways was a struggle. The weight of everyone's expectations, or rather, everyone's lack of expectation, was a physical cloak she wore, making her stoop and shrink. The story of Thorne's theory girl had spread quickly, becoming a kind of sad joke. It was the kind of story that made people shake their heads and say, "That's a shame," while also feeling a little bit better about their own struggles by day. Ilara was a portrait of failure. She was the Academy's official charity case. In the mandatory practice rooms, her struggle became a daily performance art piece. Professor Cardew took great pleasure in hovering over her, his voice a constant, syrupy drip of condescension. "Now, Ilara, remember what we discussed?" he'd say, tapping a measure on the sheet music with his pen. "Just the first two bars. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. The rhythm is 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. See? It's a heartbeat. A very simple heartbeat." He would make her play the same simple line over and over, his sighs growing more dramatic with each repetition. "It's a C sharp, my dear. A sharp note. It cuts through the air. Yours sounds a little blunt." She would nod, her face a perfect mask of concentration and despair. Her fingers, which could dance like fireflies in the dark, would stumble and fumble in the light. She would play the wrong notes with a convincing sense of frustration sometimes, letting out a quiet groan and putting her head in her hands. It was a brilliant performance, and it was working. Her friends would leave encouraging notes on her stand. Strangers would give her sympathetic looks in the cafeteria. She was the girl everyone was rooting for, even though they all knew she was going to lose. Professor Thorne's brand of torture was more psychological. He didn't speak to her directly anymore. He just watched. From across the courtyard, through the window of a faculty meeting, he would observe her, his expression unreadable. He was waiting for the crack. He wanted to be there when the pressure finally became too much, when she finally broke and ran from the academy in tears. To him, it was the final, crucial lesson of the gauntlet. Some people simply weren't built for it. And it was better to learn that now than later. But as the public performance of her failure reached its peak, a new, quieter story was starting to be told in the academy after dark. It began with Arthur, the old night janitor. Arthur was a man who lived by routine and the glow of the moon. He had been cleaning the academy for longer than most of the students had been alive. He knew its secrets, its creaks, and its cold spots. One Tuesday night, just after midnight, he was wheeling his squeaking cart down the corridor that housed the soundproof practice rooms. He heard something. It wasn't the usual hesitant, repetitive notes of a student cramming for a jury's exam. This was different. It was a river of music flowing out from under the door of one of the rooms. It was fast, complicated, and full of a raw, powerful emotion that made him stop in his tracks. He didn't know the name of the piece, but he knew what he was hearing. It was like a storm was locked inside that room, with thunder and lightning and moments of sudden, shocking beauty. He crept to the door and peered through the small glass window. The room was dark, except for the soft glow of a lamp on the piano. He could see the shape of someone at the keyboard, their body moving with the music, but he couldn't make out a face. He tried the door handle. It was locked. So he just stood there in the quiet hallway, listening. He listened until the final powerful chord rang out, and then faded into silence. The room went dark. Arthur was left standing alone with the echo of the music in his ears. He had never heard anything like it. The next morning, he mentioned it to Mrs. Ayers. Gable, the sharp but kind woman who managed the front desk. "I think we have a ghost," he said, polishing his glasses. Mrs. Gable laughed, but she loved a good story. "A ghost?" "Aye." "What kind of ghost?" "Pianist," Arthur said, completely serious. Plays like an angel having a fight with the devil. I've never heard anything like it." The story of the phantom of the practice room spread like wildfire. In a place filled with dramatic young people, it was the perfect legend. Soon, other students claimed to have heard it. A burst of impossible speed followed by a melody so sad it made your chest ache. They would leave the practice rooms late at night, looking over their shoulders, half expecting to see a ghostly figure in a tuxedo sitting at a piano. The rumor eventually reached Professor Cardew, who of course told Thorne about it with a chuckle. "It seems our students are inventing their own distractions," he said. "They've invented a ghost in the music wing, a pianist who plays in the dead of night." Thorne didn't even look up from a score he was marking. "It's probably one of the seniors trying to show off," he said, his voice dripping with boredom. "A flash of technique with no substance. They still have no discipline. They have no soul." The idea that the phantom was their quiet, failing theory student was so ridiculous, so far outside their carefully constructed worldview, that it never even occurred to them Lorraine had no idea that anyone was listening. She thought the soundproof rooms were, as the name implied, soundproof. Every evening, after another long day of being the academy's mascot for mediocrity, she would retreat to her grandmother's apartment. The long bus ride was the bridge between her two worlds. On one side was the academy, with its cold stone and crushing expectations. On the other was the small, warm apartment, filled with the scent of old books and her grandmother's lavender soap. In the soft light of a single lamp, she would sit at the old upright piano. This was where she was truly herself. Here there was no clumsy, struggling Alara. There was only the music. The scherzo, which sounded like a painful, chaotic mess in the academy practice rooms. Here was a conversation. It was a language she was born speaking. She would play for hours, exploring every nuance, every hidden emotion in the chaotic score. Her fingers, which fumbled and stumbled during the day, flew across the keys with an ease that was almost supernatural. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was telling the story of her own restless soul, a soul that felt the piece's anger and understood its fleeting moments of beauty. One night, about a week before the gauntlet, she stayed at the academy later than usual. She had gotten lost in a book on music theory in the library and didn't realize how late it was until the lights started to dim. As she was leaving, she walked past the main auditorium. The heavy door was slightly ajar. Something drew her to it. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The huge empty hall was a different world at night. Hundreds of empty seats were like a dark, silent ocean. And the stage was an island bathed in the cool gray light of the emergency fixtures. This was the place. This was where it would all end. This was where they expected her to fail publicly, completely, so that Professor Thorne could point to her as an example for years to come. She walked slowly down the aisle. Her footsteps, the only sound in the vast space. She stood at the edge of the stage, looking up at the single spotlight. She could almost feel the heat of it on her skin, the memory of being exposed and shamed. She could hear the echo of Thorne's voice in her head, calling her a lesson in humility. She walked up the stairs and onto the stage. She went over to the grand piano, the king of all pianos, and lifted the fallboard. The keys were perfect, white, and untouched. They were nothing like her grandmother's worn, forgiving ivory. These keys were for a master, a virtuoso. They were the keys of a weapon, an instrument of judgment. She sat down on the cold leather bench. For a long time, she just sat there, her hands resting in her lap. She thought about Thorne's cold eyes. She thought about Cardew's pitying pats on the shoulder. She thought about the hushed whispers of her classmates. And a feeling began to grow inside her chest, a feeling that had been sleeping for a very long time. It wasn't fear. It wasn't shame. It was anger. A quiet, steady, and powerful fire. How dare they? How dare they take this beautiful, powerful gift and try to use it to shame her? How dare they build their own reputations on the backs of students they deemed unworthy? How dare they stand in judgment of something they could never, ever understand? She placed her fingers on the keys, and she began to play. It wasn't a performance for an audience. It was a declaration. The music that came out was not the careful, practiced version she played at her grandmother's house. This was the raw, untamed version. Angry parts were filled with a new, sharp-edged fury. The sad parts were deeper, more resolute. She was no longer just interpreting Krashevsky's music. She was infusing it with her own story. The story of a girl who had been underestimated, a girl who was done being afraid. The story of the lioness who was done hiding in the shadows. She played until the first gray light of dawn started to creep through the high-arched windows of the hall. She didn't know how long she had been there, lost in the storm of her own making. She played the final crashing chord, a sound so powerful it seemed to shake the silence of the empty hall. She let the note hang in the air, a final, ringing statement. Then she stood up, lowered the fallboard, and walked away from the stage. She walked out of the auditorium and into the quiet, sleeping city. But she was not the same person who had gone in. The fear was gone. The shame was gone. All that was left was the music and a calm, unshakable certainty in her heart. They wanted a show, they were going to get one. And it was not going to be the show they were expecting. Asterisk, the night of the winter gauntlet was the coldest night of the year. A sharp, biting wind whipped through the city streets, as if the weather itself was trying to blow away all the nervous energy building up inside the old music academy. Inside, the atmosphere was thick and heavy, a mix of excitement, fear, and the electric buzz of a shared high-stakes event. The grand concert hall, usually a place of reverent silence, was alive with the murmur of hundreds of voices. It was packed to the last seat with students, faculty, proud parents, curious patrons who came to witness the annual tradition of musical trials. In the wings, backstage, the air was even more charged. Students in their formal black dresses and sharp suits were pacing, running scales silently in their heads, or staring blankly at the brick walls. And then there was Alara. She stood a little apart from the others, a quiet island in a sea of anxious energy. She wore the same simple blue dress she always did, the one she'd bought on sale 2 years ago. Her hair was down, falling softly around her shoulders. To anyone watching, she looked exactly as they expected. Small, pale, and utterly terrified. Her hands trembled slightly, but it wasn't from the cold. It was the final, trembling act of a performance that had been months in the making. Professor Cardew, bustling around in a tuxedo that seemed a little too big for him, found her hiding behind a stack of old amplifiers. "Alara," he said, his voice a strange mix of professional duty and real pity. "Are you all right, my dear? No one expects you to be perfect. Just go out there and be honest. That is all Thorne ever asks for." He gave her a clumsy pat on the shoulder, as if trying to brace her for a physical blow. "Just play what you can. We'll be proud of you for trying." His words were meant to be kind, but they landed like tiny daggers. Reinforcing the role she was supposed to play, Professor Thorne was nowhere to be seen. He was already in the audience, a king surveying his domain. He sat in the center of the front row, his posture perfect, his face a mask of cool academic expectation. He had prepared his post-recital speech, a brilliant essay on the importance of accepting one's limitations. Tonight, Alara Vance was to be his living, breathing example. He had not a single doubt in his mind about how the evening would unfold. The recital began. One by one, the students took their turn on the stage. Some were brilliant, drawing enthusiastic applause. Others were flawed, their nerves getting the better of them. But they were met with encouraging, polite clapping. The audience was supportive. It was that kind of night. But under all the applause, a current of anticipation ran through the hall. Everyone was waiting. They were waiting for the main event. They were waiting for the tragedy. Finally, the stage manager, a woman with a kind but tired face, came over to Alara. "You're on next, dear," she said softly. Alara nodded. She took one last deep breath, the kind of breath you take before diving into cold water. She could feel the eyes of the other students on her, a mix of pity and morbid curiosity. She ignored them. She walked toward the stage entrance, her steps slow and deliberate. As she stepped into the light, a sudden, absolute silence fell over the entire concert hall. It was so complete she could hear the hum of the stage lights. Every head in the audience turned to look at her. She could see their faces in the dim light expressions of sympathy, of sadness, of anticipation. She was the lamb being led to the slaughter. She walked to the center of the stage and stopped at the piano. It was the same grand piano she had played on that night alone, but now it looked different. Under the bright, hot lights, it gleamed, looking less like an instrument and more like a judge's bench. She turned and gave the audience a small, shaky bow. A few pitying claps started and quickly faded, swallowed by the overwhelming silence. She sat down on the bench. The leather was cool and smooth against her thin dress. The sheet music for the scherzo of the Restless Soul was already on the stand. She looked at it for a moment, at the chaotic black notes racing across the page. Then, she reached out with a steady hand and simply pushed the music stand away. The pages fluttered and slid to the floor. A few soft gasps came from the audience. It was a bold, almost arrogant gesture, completely out of character for the quiet girl they thought they knew. Professor Cardew, who was watching from the wings, physically winced. Alara placed her fingers on the keys. They were cool and smooth and perfectly still. She closed her eyes. She shut out the faces, the judgment, the expectations, the pity. She thought of the cold night air, the empty auditorium, the feeling of the music pouring out of her. She thought of the quiet, unshakable certainty she had found there. She was not here to fail. She was not here to be a lesson. She was here to play, and then she began. The first chord that erupted from the piano was not a hesitant question. It was a declaration of war. It was a thunderclap in the silent hall, sound so full of fury and power that it made several people physically jump in their seats. This was not the sound of a struggling student. This was the sound of a master. What followed was not just music. It was an event. The audience, which had come to watch a fall, was instead holding on for dear life. Her fingers, which everyone thought were clumsy and weak, moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible. They didn't just play the notes. They attacked them. They caressed them. They made them weep and scream. The piece was famously chaotic, a storm of conflicting rhythms and jagged harmonies. But under her hands, the chaos had a purpose. It was the sound of a mind at war with itself, of a soul in torment. She was telling Krzyzewski's story, but she was telling her own, to Dot in the front row. Professor Cardew's face went from pale to ashen. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide with disbelief. The girl he had pitied, the girl he had patted on the head and told to try her best, was speaking a language he had only ever heard on recordings, and even then, never with this much fire. He felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. He wasn't just witnessing a great performance. He was witnessing his own smallness, his own blind arrogance. And then there was Professor Thorne, the great arbiter of talent, the unmovable object. His first reaction was a sharp, intellectual annoyance. It was a trick. It had to be. But as the music poured over him, washing away his carefully constructed world, the annoyance crumbled into disbelief. The disbelief crumbled into shock. And the shock began to curdle into a cold, dawning horror. He watched her hands, not just flying, but breathing with the music. He saw the subtle shifts in her posture, the way she leaned into the passionate passages and pulled back during the moments of heartbreaking beauty. She wasn't just playing the notes correctly. She was inside the music, living it. She was showing a depth of understanding, a maturity of interpretation that he, with all his years of experience, could not have commanded. He who had built his reputation on being able to spot genius had not just missed it. He had tried to publicly crush it. He had put his own boot on the neck of a master. The piece continued, a breathtaking journey through darkness and light. There were passages of such intricate delicacy, they felt like a whisper, followed by thunderous chords that felt like a fist to the chest. The audience was no longer a collection of individuals. They were a single, breathing entity, completely captivated. They forgot to breathe. They forgot to blink. They just listened, transported by the quiet girl at the piano. Finally, she reached the end. The last few measures of the scherzo were a desperate, raging climb up the keyboard, a final, furious scream of the restless soul. And then, the final chord. It was not a loud, crashing end. It was a deep, resonant final statement that seemed to hang in the air. A single, perfect moment of profound, heartbreaking peace. Her fingers held the note, letting it vibrate through the hall, a ghost of a sound. Then, she lifted her hands and placed them softly in her lap. There was a beat of absolute, stunned silence. The entire concert hall, packed with hundreds of people, seemed to be holding its breath. The silence stretched for 3, 4, 5 seconds. And then it broke. It started as a single person clapping, then another, until it grew into a deafening, explosive roar. It was not just applause. It was a release. It was an ovation that was so loud, so immediate, so all-consuming that it shook the very walls of the old academy. In a matter of seconds, the entire audience was on its feet. A wave of humanity rising to its feet to honor the miracle they had just witnessed. Ilara opened her eyes, blinking as if waking from a long dream. The sound of the applause washed over her, a warm, overwhelming wave. For the first time, she looked out at the sea of faces, and she didn't see pity. She saw awe. She saw reverence. She saw joy. She saw tears. Her cheeks flushed, a slow, shy smile spreading across her face. She stood shakily and gave a small, bewildered bow. The applause just got louder. In the front row, Thorne stood motionless, a statue of a man, his face a canvas of shock, shame, and something that looked terrifyingly like fear. He was no longer the master of the ceremony. He was just another member of the audience, completely and utterly undone by the quiet girl he had so tragically, so foolishly underestimated. The thunderous applause felt like a physical force, a warm wind that swept over the stage and held Alara in its powerful current. She stood there for a long moment, the bright lights of the stage blurring into a sea of color, her mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. The world had shifted on its axis. The silence that had been her constant companion for months had been replaced by this overwhelming, joyful noise. When she finally managed to bow, her knees felt weak, as if she might just dissolve into the floorboards. As she straightened up, the applause only grew louder. It wasn't just polite, encouraging clapping anymore. It was something wild and real, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock and awe. People were on their feet, shouting brava, an encore. She could see the faces of her classmates in the front rows, their mouths open, their eyes wide, with a mix of disbelief and pride. They looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. When she finally turned to walk off the stage, her legs felt like they didn't belong to her. The moment she stepped into the wings, she was swallowed by a storm of excitement. Hands were grabbing her, people were hugging her, voices were speaking over each other, all saying the same thing in different ways. That was, "I have no words. Alara, where did that come from? You were a giant up there. A giant." Her friends, the ones who had brought her coffee and chocolate bars, were now looking at her with a mixture of awe and a hint of sheepishness for ever having pitied her. They surrounded her, their faces flushed with excitement, their questions a happy, chaotic jumble. She tried to answer, but all she could do was shake her head and smile. A real, genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in a very long time. Backstage was a blur of motion and sound. The other performers who had gone before her, the ones who had received polite applause, now looked at her with a new kind of respect. She was no longer the theory girl. She was the pianist who had stopped the show. The head of the department, a kind woman she barely knew, came up to her and squeezed her hands, her own eyes glistening. "My dear," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "That was the most remarkable thing I have ever heard in this hall, in all my years." Through the happy chaos, Alara saw him. Professor Cardew was standing a little way off, alone near the exit to the main hallway. He wasn't celebrating. He was just standing there, his shoulders slumped, his tuxedo suddenly looking too big, too sad. He saw her looking at him, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no anger in his expression, only a deep, hollowed-out shame. He gave her a small, helpless nod, a silent apology, and then he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Seeing him like that, she didn't feel a surge of triumph. She just felt a quiet, sad sense of pity. He was just a man who had confused authority with wisdom. And now, he was paying the price. The crowd began to thin out. But a group of well-wishers always seemed to form around her, a protective, celebratory circle. It was nearly an hour later when she finally managed to break away, needing a moment of quiet. She slipped out a side door and into the cool, clear night. The air was crisp and smelled of winter. She leaned against the cold stone wall of the academy, the muffled sounds of the party, still going on inside, drifting out to her. That's where she was when she heard the quiet footsteps behind her. She didn't have to turn to know who it was. Miss Alara. The voice was low and lacked all its usual commanding authority. It was just the voice of an old man, tired and beaten. Alara turned slowly. Professor Thorne was standing there, alone in the dimly lit alley. He looked smaller, older. The iron spine of confidence that usually held him so straight seemed to have dissolved. He wasn't looking at her with anger or even professional curiosity. He was looking at her with the wide, uncomprehending eyes of a man who has just discovered that the world is not at all what he thought it was. He took another step closer. His hands clasped behind his back. He cleared his throat, but the sound was dry and nervous. "That was quite a performance," he began. The words were hollow, a pathetic understatement of what had happened. "Thank you," Alara said, her voice quiet but steady. He shook his head slowly, as if trying to clear it. "No," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "That was not a performance. That was an exorcism, You exorcised that piece? You exorcised this entire hall." He stopped, struggling for words. A man who had always had the perfect, cutting phrase, now finding his vocabulary completely useless. He looked down at his polished shoes, then back up at her. "I was wrong," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something precious. I was not just wrong, I was deaf. For years, I've stood on that stage and lectured about passion, about truth. I have listened to thousands of students play notes, and I have been so proud of my ability to hear the difference between the good and the great. Tonight you played music. You didn't just play the notes on the page. You played the silence in between them. You played the fear in the audience. You played my own foolish arrogance back at me. And I heard it, took a shaky breath. I owe you an apology. Not as your professor, but as a man who loves music, and who in his pride has treated a miracle with contempt. I set out to make an example of you, and instead you have made a fool of me. And it is a lesson I deserved to learn. Please, he said, and for the first time she saw a flicker of real, raw vulnerability in his eyes. Forgive me, Ilara looked at him. She saw not the formidable professor who had tormented her for months, but just a man, humbled and stripped bare. She saw the deep regret in his face. In that moment, the quiet, simmering anger she had carried for so long finally dissipated, leaving behind only a sense of peace. She didn't need him to be sorry for her own sake anymore. She saw that his punishment wasn't anything she could do to him. His punishment was that he would have to live forever with the memory of the night he almost silenced a masterpiece. There's nothing to forgive, she said, and she meant it. You were just teaching what you thought you knew. He gave her a look of profound gratitude, a silent thank you for her mercy. He gave a slow, respectful nod. You will not remain in the theory program, he said. It wasn't a question. We will find a place for you, with the best teachers, myself included, if you will have me. He paused. But I would understand if you would not. He gave her one last lingering look, a look of both deep respect and profound loss, as if he were mourning the teacher he could have been for her. Then he turned and walked away, his silhouette disappearing back into the warm light of the main doors. Leaving her alone with the night, the story of the Winter Gauntlet did not end that night, but its final chapter was written in the weeks that followed. Ilara did not become an overnight sensation in the way people might think. There were no immediate headlines or record deals. Instead, a quiet and profound change took place within the walls of the academy. A world-renowned pianist who had been in the audience that night was so moved that he made a call. A full scholarship to the performance program was created just for her, funded by a private patron who wished to remain anonymous. Ilara's life changed, but she didn't change. She was still quiet, still kind, but there was a new lightness to her step, a quiet confidence in the way she carried herself. She was no longer a ghost in the halls. She walked through them with her head held high, her eyes open. Her friends were still her friends, but their relationship was different now. Built on a foundation of mutual respect rather than one-sided pity, she started taking lessons with new teachers. People who saw her not as a project, but as a peer. They challenged her, pushed her, and encouraged her. But her most important lessons still came from late nights in her grandmother's apartment, where in the soft glow of a single lamp, she would sit at the old upright piano and just play. The music was no longer a secret to be hidden. It was her truth, and she was finally free to share it with the world. She had faced the impossible and not only survived it, but had transformed it into something beautiful, proving that sometimes the quietest souls hold the most powerful music.